Please welcome Connie Marshner.
Thank you, Donna. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Okay. It really is a pleasure to be back here and to see so many people from the old days and to meet so many new people and see the best and brightest that are up there. I've got to give a little commercial. There are a couple of books by Connie Marshner in the book sale. They're old books, but they're good books. One is How to Teach Decent Exposure, How to Teach Your Children About Sex. I wrote that a long time ago because back in the 80s I was debating Planned Parenthood all over the place. And pretty much every debate would end up with them saying, well, you Christian parents don't teach your children about sex, so we have to do it. And so I wrote Decent Exposure to teach Christian parents how to teach their children about sex. And it really is a handbook for Christians how to educate your children in virtue. Because if you get all the other virtues, the sexual virtues will follow right along. It's a good book. It's a little bit dated, but it's out of print. I brought a stack of them from a box in my basement, so grab them now because when they're gone, there ain't no more. The other book is Can Motherhood Survive? A Christian Critique of Social Parenting. Social parenting is the idea that somebody other than parents knows better how to raise kids. Does that sound familiar? Beginning with daycare, okay? By the way, I also just finished my last book in December. So if anybody knows a publisher, come and talk to me. I need to know some. It's a biography of Paul Weyrich. How many people in this room know the name Paul Weyrich? Okay, that's good. That's encouraging. For those who don't know the name, you need to know him because he is the man who designed the infrastructure of the modern conservative activist movement. He founded the first conservative think tank in Washington, focused on Capitol Hill. Can you say Heritage Foundation? He only stayed there a year, though, because they wouldn't touch Roe v. Wade, and he wanted to get into that fight. So he founded the first social issues think tank, long before Focus on the Family had been heard outside of California, long before Family Research Council was a gleam in anybody's eye. He founded the first conservative PAC right after the Watergate reform laws created that political animal, and so on. He convinced Jerry Falwell to found the Moral Majority, et cetera, quite a man. And he kept a 21,000-page handwritten diary, which I have read. So it's quite a story, let me tell you. But anyhow, back to the topic. Socialization and sexualization. Socialism and sexualization, what are the antidotes? The antidote to the big problem that we've heard in so many different forms is to end America's love affair with public schools. Amen. Now, where does that love affair come from? You can't end a love affair unless you know what it's built on, right? Now, since the 1880s, late 1800s, I guess I should say, public schools have been inseparable from the whole progressivism ideology. Think John Dewey, think Jane Addams, think social workers. When I went to teacher college, I was taught that the definition of education, now get this, the definition of education, which was supposed to guide everything, was, you ready? Quote, a change in behavior, unquote. That's the definition of education that teachers are taught, not understanding the best that has been thought and said in Western civilization, not seeking truth, not saving my soul, changing behavior. Now, in the late 1800s, that wasn't so bad. It didn't play out so badly because primarily in the Northeast of the United States, that meant Americanizing immigrants, teaching them English, making their kids want to speak English, teaching them what a faucet was, because in the old country they probably hadn't ever seen one, teaching them how to cook, etc. You know, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Hygiene was probably a good thing to teach people. Public education was the heat under the great melting pot. Catholics, of course, and Lutherans too, and other denominations, wanted to educate the mind more, and they set up their own school systems. Although technically, did you realize, technically, nobody actually had a constitutional right to go to a private school until 1925, when the Supreme Court decided Pierce versus Society of Sisters and created parents' rights to educate their children, which later were amplified and in the cases that Bill Ball won to create a constitutional right to homeschooling. But back to the subject. If your purpose in education is to change behavior, that's a dangerous foundation. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Still, public education did work for a long time because we did become the greatest country in the world, right? Now, why did it work? Well, districts were small. Districts were small, and parents really controlled it. They were paying the taxes. They wanted to see them used well. That kept things in order. The kids who went to high school really wanted to learn the best that had been thought and said in Western civilization. There weren't a whole lot of them. My mother-in-law, for instance, she really wanted to go to school beyond 6th grade, but she was taken out because she had to work on the farm. That changed after World War II, when the labor unions didn't want competition, and so they raised the mandatory school attendance age. And all of a sudden, you had to be in school until you were 18. Well, that meant immediately there had to be a whole lot more teachers, right? And more people had to be hired. And then they had to be professional. And so you had to get credentialing requirements put in place. And so somebody who had been an engineer couldn't teach because he hadn't had the education courses. And so you got this whole system set up. And then districts started getting consolidated. They got bigger and bigger and bigger, as a result of which parents had less and less control. And the education establishment's proclivity to progressive ideas just ran rampant. They became a total captive of the left. And parents stopped paying attention. They hadn't had to before. They had enough to do. This was the baby boom, with lots of kids around. They were busy with other things. But it really stopped working somewhere along there. Because remember, Why Johnny Can't Read? That was published in 1957, just before the big unionization drive for teachers, and before the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which put the federal government and its money into the business of controlling education. Now, that was part of the war on poverty, done in the name of taking control of local education so that fewer people would have an inadequate education. Yeah, our education has really improved since then, right? And there were a few grumpy conservatives who didn't like the idea of ESEA, but they were told, oh, well, gee, Sputnik, arms race, oh, this is national defense. We got to get the federal government in education for the sake of national defense. Spinning is an old art. Meanwhile, something very nefarious was going on at a broader cultural level. And this is where we're beginning to get to the heart of things. Can you say political correctness? Bringing this to light, by the way, was one of the accomplishments of Paul Weyrich. This is an outgrowth of cultural Marxism. Put your minds back to World War I. The Marxist theorists at the time were fully expecting that during World War I and all the hardships throughout Europe, that the working classes would arise and overthrow their governments, as they did in Russia. But you know, a funny thing happened. They didn't rise and overthrow their government. So after things settled down, the Marxist intellectuals said, gee, what went wrong? And a group of them, known as the Frankfurt School, whom you heard Donna mention earlier, they realized, well, people didn't rise up and overthrow their government because they had ties to their family. They had ties to their churches. They loved their communities. In other words, Western culture had blinded the working class to its true economic interest of overthrowing capitalism. So, who will save us from Western culture became the problem that they had to address. There was a Marxist theorist in Hungary named Georg Lukács. He had an opportunity during the short-lived Béla Kun government to take control of some policy, and you know what he did? This is the guy who wanted to destroy Western culture. What was the first thing he did? He introduced sex education. And, you know, he knew that destroying sexual morality was the easiest way to begin to destroy Western culture. A group of his friends, Marxists in Frankfurt, created the Institute for Social Research, which came to New York before the war. They spent some time in Hollywood guiding the filmmaking industry for a while. Then they settled in New York, Columbia University, I think it was. And what they did is they crossed Marx with Freud. Okay? And what that produced was what's called critical theory, which now is the foundation for most humanities courses in every college in the country, if not the world. Out of critical theory came the operational premise that anyone who believes in traditional values, traditional Western culture, is, you know, racist, sexist, fascist, mentally ill, all the above. Who remembers the name Herbert Marcuse? Okay, when you think of Herbert Marcuse, what comes to your mind? What's his brand? Yes, make love, not war, exactly. And the pleasure principle, if it feels good, do it, became the mantra, the received wisdom, the gospel of the 60s, as opposed to the reality principle, which is, gee, actions have consequences. You got to take responsibility for your consequences. But if you're guided by the pleasure principle, you don't. Okay, so that was the theory. That was the theory that took the dominance. Now, how to implement the theory? Well, that was easy. There was a whole bunch of public schools there in need of teachers. And quietly, with nobody noticing, they infiltrated the school systems. That philosophy began to guide the formation of new educational materials and new education theory, and nobody noticed it until 1973, 74, Kanawha County, West Virginia. Anybody remember Kanawha County, West Virginia? It's the county around Charleston, West Virginia. And there was one heroic school board member named Alice Moore who suddenly woke up one day and decided to read the new textbooks the school board had just bought. And her hair stood on end. And she was absolutely appalled at the anti-Christian, anti-civilizational values in those textbooks. She started talking about it in churches. And guess what? Parents said, hey, we're not taking this. They boycotted the schools. They started home schools. They staged riots. The schools were closed. And something interesting happened. The national television media went down there to Kanawha County and, reported on it for weeks. And they, of course, thought they were getting a great story about these crazy Bible-thumping hillbillies, and ain't they ridiculous? But you know what happened? The more that was broadcast on national television, the more people said, oh, I better look at my school books. I better look at my kids' school books. And the more and more people realized they identified with those folks in West Virginia. And that was when the rot began to become apparent. That's when it became visible. The more people looked, especially Christian parents, the more they realized they didn't like what they saw. And of course, now the rot is everywhere. Fortunately, now we have the constitutional right to homeschool, and there are, as we heard the other day, 1.6 million people, maybe more, who were homeschooled. And then there are many, many and more parent-run schools that have cropped up over the place, church-run schools that have in the thousands.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, okay. Well. Sorry, I'll speak louder. But by the way, do you realize that homeschooling is not legal in most of Europe? And do you realize that we're the only country that has parent-run schools? That government does it everywhere else. So we've got something precious here. Let's hang on to it. Now, here at least you legally can take your kids out of the public schools. But first, parents have to want to do that. And parents of 50 million kids haven't gotten to that point yet. Now, the video Truth and Lies, that was a very insightful work. I'm glad they're doing that. But I was thinking as I was watching that, that's not going to convince the woman who works at 7-Eleven to take her kids out of school. It gives good talking points and good ammunition to thee and me, but it's not going to move her. So what is going to move her? I know what made me keep my kids out of public schools. Y'all probably know what makes you keep your kids out of public schools. But I wouldn't dare to presume what it might take to get the lady at 7-Eleven to keep her kids out of public schools. And to convince her husband, if she has one, to add to the complexity of her life and do what she would have to do and make the sacrifices she would have to make in order to get her kids out of the public schools? I don't know. And I don't presume to know. And you don't know either, my friends. And if we try to project our ideas onto her, we could be doing more harm than good. But it is knowable. We can know how to motivate her. Dr. Charles Kenny was a professor of psychology when one of his friends asked him, you know, Charlie, I'm the chairman of the board of a crisis pregnancy center, and the only women who come into our center have already decided to keep the baby. They want, you know, the free diapers or whatever, but the woman who's really seriously thinking of an abortion never crosses our door. How come? Good question. Why didn't the abortion-minded woman come to the crisis pregnancy center? So Charlie set about using right brain research, applying the principles of neuroscience to getting the answer to that question. It was earth-shaking. It turned around the whole crisis pregnancy center movement. All the things that the well-meaning, good people, blessed people who were running the crisis pregnancy center movement were doing were in fact having a boomerang effect and driving away the woman who was most in need of their service because the message wasn't right. It wasn't communicating with her right brain where it needed to be communicating. You know the difference between the right brain and the left brain. Left brain is analytical, logical, numerical, sequential. Right brain is the seat of memory, vision, music, and motivation. If you do typical survey research, you're asking people to think about what they think and give you an answer. And you'll get lots of answers that are probably what they think you want them to say. Or they'll think about something that they never thought about before and feel they have to say something, so they'll blurt out something. That's typical polling, standard, you know, that kind of research. That's not what Charlie does. Charlie's research gets into the right brain, into the right side of people's minds. It is a stealth weapon for our side. The other side's been using it for a long time. Lots of folks out in California came up with it 20 years ago, and they've been giving it to the left. But this is the first time our side is using it. And it is a powerful, powerful tool. This podium is not the place to explain the fine points and answer your questions. Charlie is here. Stand up, Charlie, so everybody can see you. Charlie and I will be hanging around afterwards so we can answer your questions for those of you who have longer questions. Suffice it to say, it is a tool that is only beginning to be used by conservatives, but you have to do it right. It works. It works not only with crisis pregnancy centers, but you know, a while ago, General Motors wanted to abolish the Corvette. Why? Because it wasn't selling. Nobody was buying Corvettes. Why? General Motors didn't know, And if anybody should have, it should have been them, right? But before they killed the brand, somebody said, oh, you know, I know this guy, Charlie Kenny. So they called him in. Charlie did his right brain research, and voila, Corvette is still around making money. Because he found out what they didn't know, which was how to connect with the right brain of the people who were the potential buyers. Charlie's technique gets people to tell you what their motivations are. They don't realize what they're telling you. They're just answering your open-ended questions. But Charlie finds the emotional drivers and the emotional barriers that will motivate people to take action. Motivating somebody to take action is different from asking them what they think. I mean, somebody may tell you, oh, well, I shop at Safeway because the prices are best. But maybe they really shop at Safeway because their mom used to take them there when they were a kid. See the difference? In the business world, Charlie specializes in what's called motivational research. That's the business name, marketing name for this. If you understand the emotional drivers behind consumer choices, then you can communicate the right message to the audience. That's what we have to do with education. We have to understand what the emotional drivers are that will make parents finally say, I have had enough. Okay, time to make this jump. We don't know what those emotional drivers are. We also don't know what emotional barriers there are that might prevent them from making that step. So that's the challenge that Donna has set herself. Donna has a great way, as you know, of finding the best of everything. She gets the best books, the best speakers. She's on top of the best trends. Well, she found Charlie Kenny, and now she is working with him to do this research that nobody has ever done before that can turn this situation around. If this research can be completed and implemented, the two are necessary, then it can have the power to change the whole national conversation. Happy to tell you that Donna has already begun the project. 1/3 of the cities that are to be studied have been studied, but more need to be done. And then the analysis needs to be done. Whether or not this game-changing research gets done is going to depend on you. Without your help, it can't happen. Donna, in her own sweet and inimitable way, will soon be asking you for your help. And when she does, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and our great country, for the sake of the future of Western civilization, please pay attention to her request and listen to it seriously and make right brain research happen for saving American education. Thank you.